Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is Chapter 53. On the 12th of November, Kutuzov's active army, encamped before Omsk, was preparing to be reviewed next day by the two emperors, the Russian and the Austrian. The guards, just arrived from Russia, spent the night 10 miles from Omsk, and next morning were to come straight to the review, reaching the field at Omsk by 10 o'clock. That day, Nicholas Rostov received a letter from Boris, telling him that the Ismailov regiment was quartered for the night 10 miles from Omsk, and that he wanted to see him, as he had a letter and money for him. Rostov was particularly in need of money now that the troops, after their active service, were stationed near Omsk, and the camp swarmed with well-provisioned sutlers and Austrian Jews offering all sorts of tempting wares. The Pavlograds held feast after feast, celebrating awards they had received for the campaign, and made expedition to Omsk to visit a certain Caroline, the Hungarian, who had recently opened a restaurant there with girls as waitresses. Rostov, who had just celebrated his promotion to a cornetcy and bought Denisov's horse, Bedouin, was in debt all around, to his comrades in the sutlers. On receiving Boris's letter, he rode with a fellow officer to Omsk, dined there, drank a bottle of wine, and then set off alone to the guards' camp to find his old playmate. Rostov had not yet had time to get his uniform. He had on a shabby cadet jacket, decorated with a soldier's cross, equally shabby cadet's riding breeches lined with worn leather, and an officer's saber with a sword knot. The Don horse he was riding was one he had brought from a Cossack during the campaign, and he wore a crumpled hussar cap stuck jauntily back on one side of his head. As he rode up to the camp, he thought how he would impress Boris and all his comrades of the guards by his appearance, that of a fighting hussar who had been under fire. The guards had made their whole march as if on a pleasure trip, parading their cleanliness and discipline. They had come by easy stages, their knapsacks conveyed on carts, and the Austrian authorities had provided excellent dinners for the officers at every halting place. The regiments had entered and left town with their bands playing, and by the Grand Duke's orders the men had marched all the way in step, a practice on which the guards prided themselves, the officers on foot and at their proper posts. Boris had been quartered and had marched all the way, with Berg, who was already in command of a company. Berg, who had obtained his captaincy during the campaign, had gained the confidence of his superiors by his promptitude and accuracy, and had arranged his money matters very satisfactorily. Boris, during the campaign, had made the acquaintance of many persons who might prove useful to him, and by a letter of recommendation he had brought from Pierre, had become acquainted with Prince Andrew Bolkonsky, through whom he hoped to obtain a post on the commander-in-chief's staff. Berg and Boris, having rested after yesterday's march, were sitting, clean and neatly dressed, at a round table in the clean quarters allotted to them, playing chess. Berg held a smoking pipe between his knees. Boris, in the accurate way characteristic of him, was building a little pyramid of chessmen with his delicate white fingers while awaiting Berg's move, and watched his opponent's face, evidently thinking about the game, as he always thought only of whatever he was engaged in. "Well, how are you going to get out of that?" he remarked. "We'll try to," replied Berg, touching a pawn and then removing his hand. At that moment, the door opened. "Here he is at last!" shouted Rostov. "And Berg, too! Aha, you and your cushy sleeping arrangements," he exclaimed, imitating his Russian nurse's French, at which he and Boris used to laugh long ago. Dear me, how you have changed." Boris rose to meet Rostov, but in doing so did not omit to steady and replace some chessmen that were falling. He was about to embrace his friend, but Nicholas avoided him. With that peculiar feeling of youth, that dread of beaten tracks, and wish to express itself in a manner different from that of its elders, which is often insincere, Nicholas wished to do something special on meeting his friend. He wanted to pinch him, push him, do anything but kiss him, a thing everyone did. But notwithstanding this, Boris embraced him in a quiet, friendly way and kissed him 3 times. They had not met for nearly nearly half a year. And being at the age when young men take the first steps on life's road, each saw immense changes in the other, quite a new reflection of the society in which they had taken those first steps. Both had changed greatly since they last met, and both were in a hurry to show the changes that had taken place in them. "Oh, you damned dandies! Clean and fresh as if you'd been to a fete, not like us sinners on the line," cried Rostov, with martial swagger, and with baritone notes in his voice, new to Boris, pointing to his own mud-bespattered breeches. The German landlady, hearing Rostov's loud voice, popped her head in the door. Is she pretty?" he asked with a wink. "Why do you shout so? You'll frighten them," said Boris. "I did not expect you today," he added. "I only sent you the note yesterday by Bolkonsky, an adjutant of Kutuzov's, who is a friend of mine. I did not think he would get it to you so quickly. Well, how are you? Been under fire already?" asked Boris. Without answering, Rostov shook the soldier's cross of St. George fashioned to the cording of his uniform and, indicating a bandaged arm, glanced at Berg with a smile. "As you see," he said. "Indeed, yes," said Boris with a smile. "And we too have had a splendid march. You know, of course, that His Imperial Highness rode with our regiment all the time, so that we had every comfort and every advantage. What receptions we had in Poland! What dinners and balls, I can't tell you. And the Tsarevich was very gracious to all our officers." And the two friends told each other of their doings, the one of his hussar revels and life in the fighting line, the other of the pleasures and advantages of service under members of the imperial family. "You guards," said Rostov. "I say, send for some wine." Boris made a grimace. "If you really want it," said he. He went to his bed, drew a purse from under the clean pillow, and sent for wine. "Yes, and I have some money and a letter to give you," he added. Rostov took the letter, and throwing the money on the sofa, put both arms on the table and began to read. After a few lines, he glanced angrily at Berg, then, meeting his eyes, hid his face behind the letter. "Well, they've sent you a tidy sum," said Berg, eyeing the heavy purse that sank into the sofa. "As for us, Count, we get along on our pay, I can tell you from myself." "I say, Berg, my dear fellow," said Rostov, "when you get a letter from home, and meet one of your own people whom you talk to everything over with, and I happen to be there, I'll go at once to be out of your way. Do go somewhere, anywhere, to the devil," he exclaimed, and immediately seizing him by the shoulder and looking amiably into his face, evidently wishing to soften the rudeness of his words, he added, "Don't be hurt, my dear fellow. You know I speak from my heart as to an old acquaintance." "Oh, don't mention it, Count. I quite understand," said Berg, getting up and speaking in a muffled and guttural voice. "Go across to our host. They invited you," said Boris. Berg put on the cleanest of coats, without a spot or speck of dust on it, stood before a looking-glass and brushed the hair of his temples upwards, in the way affected by the Emperor Alexander, and having assured himself, from the way Rostov looked at it, that his coat had been noticed, he left the room with a pleasant smile. "Oh dear, what a beast I am," muttered Rostov as he read the letter. "Why? Oh, what a pig I am, not to have written and to have given them such a fright. What a pig I am," he repeated, flushing suddenly. "Well, have you sent Gabriel for some wine? All right, let's have some." In the letter from his parents was enclosed a letter of recommendation to Bagration, which the old countess, at Anna Mikhailovna's advice, had obtained through an acquaintance and sent to her son, asking him to take it to its destination and make use of it. "What nonsense! Much I need it," said Rostov, throwing the letter under the table. "Why have you thrown that away?" asked Boris. "It is some letter of recommendation. What the devil do I want it for?" "Why, what the devil?" said Boris, picking it up and reading the address. "This letter would be of great use to you. I want nothing, and I won't be anyone's adjutant." "Why not?" inquired Boris. "It's a lackey's job." You are still the same dreamer, I see," remarked Boris, shaking his head. "And you're still the same diplomatist. But that's not the point. Come, how are you? asked Rostov. Well, as you can see, so far everything's all right, but I confess I should much like to be an adjutant and not remain at the front. Why? Because when once a man starts a military service, he should try to make as successful a career of it as possible. Ah, that's it, said Rostov, evidently thinking of something else. He looked intently and inquiringly into his friend's eyes, evidently trying in vain to find the answer to some question. Old Gabriel brought in the wine. Shouldn't we now send for Berg? Asked Boris. He would drink with you. I can't. Well, send for him. And how do you get on with that German? Asked Rostov with a contemptuous smile. He's a very, very nice, honest, and pleasant fellow, answered Boris. Again Rostov looked intently into Boris's eyes and sighed. Berg returned, and over the bottle of wine conversation between the three officers became animated. The guardsmen told Rostov of their march, and how they had been made much of in Russia, Poland, and abroad. They spoke of the sayings and doings of their commander, the Grand Duke, and told stories of his kindness and irascibility. Berg, as usual, kept silent when the subject did not relate to himself, and in connection with the stories of the Grand Duke's quick temper, he related with gusto how in Galicia he had managed to deal with the Grand Duke when the latter made a tour of the regiments, and was annoyed at the irregularity of a movement. With a pleasant smile, Berg related how the Grand Duke had ridden up to him in a violent passion, shouting "Aeronauts!" Aeronauts was the Tsarevich's favorite expression when he was in a rage, and called for the company commander. Won't you believe it, Count? I was not at all alarmed, because I knew I was right. Without boasting, you know, I may say that I know the army orders by heart, and know the regulations as well as I do the Lord's Prayer. So, Count, there never is any negligence in my company, and so my conscience was at ease. I came forward. Berg stood up and showed how he presented himself, with his hand to his cap, and really it would have been difficult for a face to express greater respect and self-complacency than his did. Well, he stormed at me, as the saying is, stormed and stormed and stormed. It was not a matter of life, but rather of death, as the saying is. Albanians and devils and to Siberia, said Berg with a sagacious smile. I knew I was in the right, so I kept silent. Was not that best, Count? Eh, are you dumb? He shouted. Still, I remained silent. And what do you think, Count? The next day it was not even mentioned in the orders of the day. That is what keeping one head means. That's the way, Count, said Berg, lighting his pipe and emitting rings of smoke. Yes, that was fine, said Rostov, smiling. But Boris noticed that he was preparing to make fun of Berg, and skillfully changed the subject. He asked him to tell them how and where he got his wound. This pleased Rostov, and he began talking about it, and as he went on became more and more animated. He told them of his Schorngraben affair, just as those who have taken part in a battle generally do describe it, that is, as they would have liked it to have been, as they have heard it described by others, and as sounds well, but not at all as it really was. Rostov was a truthful young man, and would on no account have told a deliberate lie. He began his story meaning to tell everything just as it happened, but imperceptibly, involuntarily, and inevitably, he lapsed into falsehood. If he had told the truth to his hearers, who, like himself, had often heard stories of attacks and had formed a definite idea of what an attack was and were expecting to hear just such a story, they would either have not believed him, or worse still, would have thought that Rostov was himself to blame, since what generally happens to the narrators of cavalry attacks had not happened to him. He could not tell them simply that everyone went at a trot, and that he fell off his horse and sprained his arm, and then ran as hard as he could from a Frenchman into the wood. Besides, to tell everything as it really happened, it would have been necessary to make an effort of will to tell only what happened. It is very difficult to tell the truth, and young people are rarely capable of it. His hearers expected a story of how beside himself and all aflame with excitement he had flown like a storm at the square, cut his way in, slashed right and left, how his saber had tasted flesh, and he had fallen exhausted, and so on. And so he told them all that. In the middle of the story, just as he was saying, "You cannot imagine what a strange frenzy one experiences during attack," Prince Andrew, whom Boris was expecting, entered the room. Prince Andrew, who liked to help young men, was flattered by being asked for his assistance, and being well disposed towards Boris, had managed to please him the day before. He wished to do what the young man wanted. Having been sent with papers from Kutuzov to the Tsarevich, he looked in on Boris, hoping to find him alone. When he came in, and saw Tsar on the line recounting his military exploits, Prince Andrew could not endure that sort of man, he gave Boris a pleasant smile. frowned as with half-closed eyes he looked at Rostov, bowed slightly and warily, and sat down languidly on the sofa. He felt it unpleasant to have dropped in on bad company. Rostov flushed up upon noticing this, but he did not care. This was a mere stranger. Glancing, however, at Boris, he saw that he too seemed ashamed of the hussar of the line. In spite of Prince Andrew's disagreeable, ironical tone, in spite of the contempt with which Rostov, from his fighting army point of view, regarded all these little adjutants on the staff, of whom the newcomer was evidently one, Rostov felt confused, blushed, and became silent. Boris inquired what news there might be of on the staff, and what, without discretion, one might do about our plans. "We shall probably advance," replied Bolkonsky, evidently reluctant to say more in the presence of a stranger. Berg took the opportunity to ask, with great politeness, whether, as was rumored, the allowance of forage money to captains of companies would be doubled. To this Prince Andrew answered with a smile that he could give no opinion on such an important government order, and Berg laughed gaily. "As to your business," Prince Andrew continued, addressing Boris, "we will talk of it later." And he looked around at Rostov. "Come to me after the review, and we'll do what is possible." And having glanced around the room, Prince Andrew returned to Rostov, whose state of unconquerable childish embarrassment now changing to anger he did not condescend to notice, and said, "I think you were talking of the Schöngrabern affair. Were you there?" "I was there," said Rostov angrily, as if intending to insult the aide-de-camp. Bolkonsky noticed the hussar's state of mind, and it amused him. With a slightly contemptuous smile, he said, "Yes, there are many stories now told about that affair." "Yes, stories," repeated Rostov loudly, looking with eyes suddenly grown furious, now at Boris, now at Bolkonsky. "Yeah, many stories. But our stories are the stories of men who have been under the enemy's fire. Our stories have weight, not like the stories of those fellows on the staff who get rewards without doing anything." "Of whom you imagine me to be one," said Prince Andrew, with a quiet and particularly amiable smile. A strange feeling of exasperation and yet of respect for this man's self-possession mingled at that moment in Rostov's soul. "I am not talking about you," he said. "I don't know you, and frankly, I don't want to know you. I'm speaking of the staff in general." "And I will tell you this," Prince Andrew interrupted in a tone of quiet authority. "You wish to insult me, and I am ready to agree with you that it would be very easy to do so if you haven't sufficient self-respect, but admit that the time and place are very badly chosen. In a day or two we shall have all to take part in a greater and more serious duel, and besides, Trubetskoy, who says he is an old friend of yours, is not at all to blame that my face has the misfortune to displease you. However," he added, rising, "you know my name and where to find me, but don't forget that I do not regard either myself or you as having been at all insulted, and as a man older than you, my advice is to let the matter drop. Well then, on Friday after the review I shall expect you, Trubetskoy. Au revoir," exclaimed Prince Andrew, and with a bow to them they went out. Only when Prince Andrew was gone did Rostov think of what he ought to have said, and he was still more angry at having omitted to say it. He ordered his horse at once, and coldly taking leave of Boris, rode home. Should he go to headquarters next day and challenge that affected adjutant, or really let the matter drop? This was the question that worried him all the way. He thought angrily of the pleasure he would have at seeing the fright of that small and frail but proud man when covered by his pistol, and then he felt with surprise that of all the men he knew, there were none he would so much like to have for a friend as that very adjutant whom he so hated. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 53. I'll now move into my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 53. Fictions of Merit. All's bad that ends bad for Rostov today, because, as Parolles reminds us, it will come to pass that every braggart shall be found an ass. You'll recall that Rostov's first encounter with battle did not end as heroically as he envisioned it might have. Indeed, it's difficult to imagine a more embarrassing episode than a falling off of a horse and then running away from a Frenchman. Yet, Rostov's pride and vanity in this chapter somehow manages to embarrass him further. We begin by learning that Rostov, following his father, has accumulated some debts at camp. So it's very lucky for him then that he learns a letter from his family with some money in it is waiting for him with Boris at Omsk. As he sets off for Omsk, his pride captures him immediately. He doesn't clean himself up because he wishes to present to Boris the impressive, though completely false, image of a man under constant fire at the front. He even calls attention to his muddied breeches when he arrives, just to make sure Boris takes notice. Rostov then proceeds to tell of his war stories. His aforementioned fearful retreat just won't do, however, so he launches into a little untruthful boasting and fabrication. Prince Andrew, who enters the room while Rostov is in the middle of his warrior's tale, isn't having it at all. He recognizes the falsehood for what it is and, while not directly insulting Rostov, lets it be known that he is not impressed. Tolstoy writes that Rostov's experiences a state of unconquerable childish embarrassment at this exchange. Soon this embarrassment, as we've come to expect from Rostov, converts into anger. But Rostov cannot bring himself to challenge Prince Andrew. In fact, Rostov is so impressed with Prince Andrew's cool and self-controlled behavior that he actually wants to be his friend. We are Rostov. We know it. We tend to minimize our faults and magnify, or even just create, our virtues. We are the authors of our great fictions of merit. And, just like Rostov today, our empty boasting can lead to unfortunate circumstances. Better to be truthful to ourselves and others and follow the path of moderation. Daily meditation. Repellent attire, unkempt hair, slovenly beard, open scorn of silver dishes, a couch on the bare earth, and any other perverted forms of self-display are to be avoided. Seneca, Letter on Moderation. Alright, that concludes my reading and reflection on Chapter 53 of War and Peace. Thanks for joining me. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are below. Your support is greatly appreciated. Tomorrow we'll be reading and reflecting on Chapter 54 of War and Peace. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.